Hello, everybody. In Chapter 3, you're going to start applying some of the terminology that you learned in Chapter 2 to describe and analyze music. And specifically, Chapter 3 focuses on three different examples that all contrast, both in geographic origin and time. So I want to talk a little bit about those and how we're going to start taking that terminology that you learned to describe the music, and start also bringing in elements of social context, economic context, political context, and things like that in your analyses. And what I'd like you to do when you're going through these listening guides, listening to this music, and thinking about it, is just start allowing yourself in the back of your mind, as you're sort of beginning in the very early stages of thinking about your final paper, because in that paper you're gonna compare and contrast different music, and you're gonna want to analyze it, in this very meaningful way. And what we'd like to really get out of this is how can we take that descriptive terminology we learned in Chapter 2, that more technical language, and how can we marry it to an analysis of the social context and some of these other factors that go into the production of music. So, the first piece that you have in Chapter 3 to listen to is Bach's Bourrée in E minor. And as you're thinking about that, go through the biography of Bach at the beginning, and notice that this piece comes out of Bach's Weimar period, which is when he was working as a court composer for the nobility in Weimar. So a lot of his musical output that we're familiar with is his religious output, which he wrote all through his career, and he wrote secular music all through his career. But a lot of his great religious output comes from when he was in Leipzig as the Kapellmeister. So he was working for a church. So what we're looking at here is, who is Bach working for? Where is the money coming from that funds his composition? And in this case, it's the nobility in Weimar. And so it's no coincidence then that a lot of his output at this time, including the Bourrée that we're listening to, was a court dance to be danced by nobles. So that little economic fact right there explains some motivation for the piece, the sort of how, when, where, and why, and the economic conditions that surrounded it. And you can marry that to contextual analysis to a more technical analysis of it as well. You can talk about that short, short, long, short, short, long, repetitive rhythmic pattern that goes throughout the entire piece. And you could describe, why is that good for dancing, particularly a courtly social dance, which was not really meant to be too rowdy, right? It's a very sort of controlled dance. And so these are the kinds of things we want to be thinking about. The second thing I'd like you to notice as you get, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, as we get to the discussion of Over the Rainbow. I think this is a really important piece to highlight, because Over the Rainbow is written in 1938, recorded in 1938 by Julie Garland in The Wizard of Oz. So it's for a movie. So we've jumped ahead several hundred years from Bach into a very different context. And one of the things that you'll notice as you're going through this is it's in that AABA 32-bar song form. And that form is so pervasive and important for American popular music. Now, let's think about why. So Judy Garland sings this for a 1938 movie. Who goes to see movies, right? So just like the Bach was written for the nobility, we're going to ask ourselves, who was this piece of music written for? And in the case of a movie in the early 20th century, it's really a wide audience. Rich, poor, middle class, people go see movies. And so now we're appealing, rather than to a specific noble set of people, we're appealing to a wider mass market. And so we want to ask ourselves, well, what is that 32-bar song form? Why is it so pervasive in that? Well, it's a couple things that we could observe about it. Is that it's short. It's just repetitive enough that the melody can get stuck in your head. But there is some contrast with that B section, and you'll hear that when you listen to this piece of music. So really follow that form and be thinking about, why does this work so well for popular music? And then finally, the other performance of Over the Rainbow that you'll listen to comes from the great virtuosic pianist, jazz pianist, Art Tatum. And I think another thing to highlight here is that jazz pianists in Tatum's day, especially as we come into the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, into the middle of the 20th century, and we start to see jazz music really take off as a popular medium, the repertoire that they used was primarily what comes from what's called the Great American Songbook, and that's just kind of like idea, the sort of loose connection of um, well-known American popular music from the early to mid 20th century, and potentially a little bit later, but a lot of it comes from that time period. And so, where do these songs come from? A lot of them come from Broadway musical theater. Some of them were just published as songs, and a lot of them come from Hollywood. So, Over the Rainbow is one of these. It's this 32 bar song form, which most of them were. 32 bar song form taken from Hollywood that audiences would have been familiar with, and listen to what Tatum does with it. So Tatum takes it and he improvises on it and he elaborates it and he makes it into this showpiece of virtuosic ability. He also demonstrates something he was famous for called the stride technique, which is where his left hand goes from a low bass note to a chord, jumps back and forth. And you'll hear this a lot after he's gone through the form once and goes back through and plays it again, this time with more improvisatory flair, I guess you could say. That's about a minute and a half in. So as he's going through and you're hearing the stride technique, you might want to go back and compare that to something like a Scott Joplin ragtime. You can look up Scott Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag, for example. And that's where that stride technique comes from, or at least where it was popularized. You could find examples maybe earlier, but it was really popularized in the ragtime period, and that's an element that survived into Tatum's jazz piano playing. That's really important as well. So as you're going through this music, and I didn't get to everything in the chapter, but as you're going through this music, be thinking about these things. Be thinking about the difference in audience, the difference in sort of economic motivators, time and place, repertoire. These things really coalesce when we're talking about different kinds of music and what was popular, what was written, and why, and how these musical elements contribute to the sort of reasons for writing that piece of music. Again, we can talk about the rhythm and the beret. We could even look at why is a binary form useful for a dance. What does the binary form do? I mean, it's short. It's somewhat repetitive, but there's enough contrast. So you can talk about these things and think about them in those contexts, those broader biographical and social contexts. And that's where your analysis is really going to start to get interesting. So as you were beginning to think about your final paper, I know it's still early, but as you were starting to let ideas in your head percolate on what you'd like to do your final paper on, be listening to music like this and be thinking about these things when you go through the listening guides for the pieces in your listening assignments folder this week. All right, so good luck with all of that. Have fun.